Welcome this evening to 4RGMeets. We're so happy that you could join us, and we're looking forward to Cathy's presentation on trees. Before we begin, we have a few announcements. My name is Beth McKinley, and
I am Scott McKinley. So as I begin my land acknowledgement, I'd just like to take a moment for those of us, which are most of us, that are not Indigenous, to consider their relationship with this land, as well as Indigenous people, which we often talk about. I spent most of today with a friend who I think is online with us here today, looking for birds. And not only did we see almost 50 species today of birds, but we saw fishers and muskrat and flooded creeks and fields and silver maples trees bursting their buds into flowers, all responding to each other and what the earth provides in this ever-changing seasons. So I want each of us here today to think of themselves as part of that changing season, part of the earth, and remember that everything that we do affects all our earthmates. So we would like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the ancestral lands and waters of the Anishinaabe and Mississauga peoples, lands covered by the Williams Treaty and Treaty 20. We acknowledge this land out of respect for the Indigenous peoples and who have cared for these lands of Turtle Island since long before the arrival of settlers. We say miigwech, which thank you to the Indigenous nations and peoples for welcoming settlers with friendship and for sharing this land with those of us who are newcomers. We aim to live respectfully in peace, friendship, and reconciliation with the original peoples, and not forget that we are all treaty people, which means that we have obligations to the First Nations as outlined in the treaties. We also aim to live respectfully with the land and with all creatures.
Yeah. Sorry. Okay, so before we get to Cathy, we just have a couple of things to mention about For Our Grandchildren and a couple of announcements. So 4RG, as many of you know, is a Peterborough-based climate action group, and our mission is to inspire, inform, and mobilize people to take effective action in response to the climate crisis. We hope to empower people to be part of the solution. You can follow us on Facebook, either the page or our private group, Instagram, and our website has tons of information, and you can sign up for the newsletter and become a member. Many people ask us, what can I do about climate change? It seems so overwhelming. And Catherine Hayhoe, the Canadian climate scientist and educator, recommends that the most important thing we can do about climate change is to talk about it. And so here we are talking about it. But today we also have a suggested action. As many of you will have heard if you follow the news, last week the IPCC report reminded us once again of how serious this is. And then a couple of days later, we saw the Bay du Nord project become approved. And so what we'd like to recommend as a suggested action is that you either or both and or write to politicians. And I'm going to put email addresses in the chat for different politicians that you can write to let them know what you think. And as well, writing a letter to the editor is really helpful. I'm going to put a link in the chat to a letter that Guy Hanchette wrote to the editor, which was published in the Toronto Star. And then I'll also put a link into the chat, which describes, if you haven't heard what Bay du Nord is, we'll tell you a little bit about that. Other ways you can become more involved with For Our Grandchildren is through our political action committee, which will be very active getting ready for the provincial election. We have a communications committee, event planning, etc. So you can check out our webpage to see how to volunteer. And if you sign up to volunteer, you will get a phone call from Connie McCracken, who will ask you what you want to do and what you're good at, which is amazing. So before we move on, I just want to tell you about upcoming events, and I think I will pass it over to you, Connie. Can you tell us about the tree event?
Yeah, I'd love to. First of all, I want to thank Cathy for presenting tonight on trees. That's awesome. I really wanted people to learn more about the importance of trees this month, because on next month, Saturday, May 14th, we're going to have an event. It's actually called Trees for Canopy Conservation. We're helping with it's a City of Peterborough event, Saturday, May 14th, 10 to 3. I've been working with a great committee on this for months and really hoping 4RG to get more young people involved. I'm very happy that Glenn Karatis is going to do a puppeteer show for us. And so the children and families will have a fun way to learn about trees. The city will be giving away 200 trees and doing a presentation on how to care and plant for them. But 4RG has been working on a lot of presentations and events, including our lovely host, Beth and Scott, doing a presentation. That's going to be awesome. And we're going to be together with a lot of collaborators. There's going to be Green Up, Sacred Water Circle, Otonabee Regional Conservation Authority, Peterborough Youth Empowerment, Peterborough Alliance for Climate Action, Camp Kawartha. I think Jacob's with us tonight, so he'll have an awesome table to visit. Kawartha Land Trust, Peterborough Kawartha Rotary, and Catchacoma Forest Stewardship Committee. Peter Currier and Dave will be doing a pretty cool presentation on trees as well. So I'm really hoping that everybody will pass this information on to friends and family so that we can get lots of nieces, nephews, grandkids, just everybody to have a great day over at Beaver Mead Park.
Great, thank you, Connie. And before we begin with Cathy, I just want to let you folks know that next month's 4RGMeets we'll be focusing on gardening in an era of climate change. And Deborah Pearson, who is here this evening, will be talking about how to adapt your gardening to climate change, what to plant, given different moisture levels, temperature levels, how to protect plants from increasingly high temperatures, and how to create an eco-friendly backyard using native species. So we really look forward to that.
All right, so finally, we'll get to our guest speaker. Sorry for the long introductions today. So trees have always been a big part of Cathy Dueck's life. As a graduate of Trent University's environmental science program, she managed a community tree nursery at the Ecology Park for more than 20 years. She also initiated a community-based urban forestry program in Peterborough, teaching many volunteers how to assess the health of their trees and collect important information for urban forest planning. Today, she teaches a course in environmental education at Trent University and coordinates a project to help children develop leadership and stewardship skills, which myself and 2 or 3 other people here tonight are a part of. So it's good stuff. So Cathy, you've already unmuted yourself, so that's great. And yeah, so Cathy will speak for about probably about 30 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions. And we'll tell everybody when 8 o'clock arrives so that if they have to be somewhere else, they can go. But if questions keep going and the discussion keeps going, then we'll go as long as we need to after that. So Cathy, take it away.
Thank you so much. And I am going to share my screen. And I hope that you'll all be able to see that, okay? Everybody see that? Well, as Scott mentioned, trees have been a favorite part of my life for as long as I can remember, back to my earliest days of childhood. And I could talk for hours about trees, so I'm going to try and keep an eye on the clock and focus on some specific aspects relating trees to climate change. And I'd like to start by looking at the big picture, the global issue of what role can trees play in mitigating climate change. And then for about the last half of my talk, I'd like to focus a little more locally on what's the situation in Peterborough and how can we play a role in supporting trees in our own communities and in our own yards. Now, we'll start with some basics. In a nutshell, climate change is a result of too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and trees remove carbon dioxide from the air So it seems like they go together pretty well. Can trees solve the global problem of climate change? I know one of the first discussions that I heard about climate change many years ago on CBC, they were saying, oh, if only we could invent something that would take CO2 out of the air. And my first reaction was, have you ever heard of a tree? But unfortunately, as with many things in life, it's a little more complicated than it might seem on the surface. So just going back to grade school science, and it seems that just about the youngest child can tell you, trees put oxygen into the air and we need oxygen to breathe. So that's true, that the miracle of photosynthesis takes light energy and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and water and transforms that into food in the form of sugar and releases oxygen. But unfortunately, it's not just a one-way street. It's not just a matter of trees forever taking in carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen. Trees also breathe the same way that people do. So there's a certain amount of oxygen taken in and CO2 released in plant respiration. Trees don't live forever, so eventually they die or parts of them die and decompose. So it's a constantly changing scenario of sequestration, fixing of carbon, and release of carbon. Now, I think that it's rather eye-opening to look at where trees store carbon. And this particular graphic comes from the UK. And many people, when they think of the carbon that's tied up in trees, think about what's going on above ground and think of the carbon stored in the leaves and in the trunk, in the branches. Some people might be thinking about the carbon that's stored through the roots as well. It's great. Many people don't often think about what's going on underground because we can't see that. But in these United Kingdom figures, about 17% of the total carbon stored through the life of trees is stored in the above ground leaves, branches, and trunk, and about 6% stored in the roots. And there's a certain amount, small percentage, stored in the surface litter and in fallen dead wood. But what I think is the really eye-opening part of this graphic is the amount of carbon that's stored in the soil. Now that's not including the roots. So tremendous amount of partially decomposing organic material, humus, and directly related to the amount of humus in the soil, the tremendous amount of microbial activity in the soil. And a lot of recent research and very popular books have really pointed out the critically important role that fungal associations play in supporting trees. So these fungi, known scientifically as mycorrhiza, either inhabit the interior of roots or they sheath the outside of tree roots. And they have a wonderful symbiotic relationship where the tree feeds the mycorrhiza sugars from photosynthesis, and the mycorrhiza are able to transform nitrogen, which is normally in a form in the soil, in the air pockets in the soil, that a form that plants can't take in, and it can transfer that into a nitrogen fertilizer, essentially a form that that plants can take up. So that underground activity is critically important in the amount of carbon that trees can play a role in storing. Now, apparently global averages are closer to 50% above ground and 50% below ground, but I think that there's an interesting point made here, especially in well-established old forests, just the amount of carbon that can be stored underground. Now, in preparing for this talk, I looked at a number of global estimates of annual CO2 emissions, And of course, there's quite a lot of variety in any sort of global figures. I think we always need to take this with a grain of salt. But let's say on average, currently about 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide are being emitted into the global atmosphere every year primarily through burning fossil fuels. And we won't get into, at this point, into which countries are responsible for how much. We'll just look at the overall figure. So just try and keep in mind 36 billion tons. Now, of course, and I'm sure, especially with this crowd, this is not news to you folks, the concentration of atmospheric carbon dioxide has increased dramatically since pre-industrial times. And it's estimated that we have just about doubled the amount of carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And a lot of that has happened in the last 50 or 60 years. So we have more CO2 in the atmosphere than we want. We're putting more in every year. So we have a two-part challenge. We need to reduce the current levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And we also need to significantly reduce the annual inputs of CO2, so preventing further increase of global atmospheric carbon. So can trees do this job? Well, let's have a look. So if we look at that annual average of about 36 billion tons, how much of that is currently being sequestered on land or in the oceans? So you can see that there's a significant amount of CO2 that is sequestered in oceans, and we won't get, given the time we have tonight, we won't get into how that happens. But on land, I think the really relevant point here in this graphic is that there's a great deal of annual variation in terrestrial ecosystems' ability to absorb all of that carbon dioxide. And the fact that it goes up and down so much really is attributable to the fact that we have wildfire burns, we have deforestation globally, we have insect infestations, frequently from invasive species of insects that can kill significant tracts of forested land. So this is potential that goes up and down on an annual basis. So as we know, global forests are a really important storehouse for carbon. So they store it in their tissues and they draw more from the air every year. And Canada's boreal forest is a really important carbon sink. But tropical rainforests are the most efficient forests in the world at capturing carbon and sequestering it. And this is partly because they can photosynthesize all year round. In our climate, when we have temperatures below freezing for a good portion of the year, trees can only photosynthesize when the ground is thawed out, essentially. So there's a limited amount of time in the year that they can be sequestering carbon. So modeling from Global Forest Watch compared the estimated annual amount of carbon sequestered by global forests to be roughly 15.6 gigatons or billion tons of CO2 a year. And because of forest disturbance, natural and human-caused forest disturbance, deforestation, wildfires, as we mentioned, that cancels out about 8 gigatons of CO2 sequestration per year. So that leaves us with an overall gain, an overall sink of 7.6 gigatons of CO2 per year. So If we compare that with our previous number of 36 gigatons of carbon going into the atmosphere every year, we can see that forests alone cannot do the job. And I've seen many different estimates, but on average, our current forests could remove between about 1/4 and 1/5 of the annual CO2 emissions. So they do have an important role to play. Now, there was a study released in 2019 from Switzerland that claimed that if we went out and planted trees on all the available land worldwide, now that's excluding land that's currently in agricultural production, that at maturity, those trees would store 752 billion tons of carbon when they're mature. So that would be about 20 years of current annual carbon emissions. And their claim in this study was that planting trees is one of the most effective carbon drawdown solutions to date. So many governments worldwide got on the bandwagon and yes, all we need to do is plant trees. Let's plant 5 billion trees. Let's plant 10 billion trees. And certainly tree planting is a good thing to do. But there was a firestorm of criticism about that particular study. And in fact, they had to retract some of their claims. And some of the problems with just assuming that trees are going to solve the climate change problem are, first of all, not all currently untreed areas are suitable for tree growth. And there are many other terrestrial ecosystems, prairies, wetlands that are really important parts of biodiversity, play really important roles as well. It would be misguided for us to just run out and plant trees everywhere. And unfortunately, many of these tree planting projects focus on the number of trees planted, and there's generally very poor follow-up in monitoring, okay, what is the actual long-term survival rate of these species? And many well-intentioned tree planting projects actually have a very low survival rate, partly because of poor species selection, a variety of environmental stresses, which of course are increasing every year due to climate change, and lack of aftercare is one of the big factors in failure of newly planted trees. And another problem is that newly planted trees, if they are cared for and they do survive, they can take a long time to start sequestering carbon, and we need a change immediately. And it's also a really relevant point that plantations capture far less carbon than natural forests, partly because natural forests have evolved over centuries in many cases and have had time to develop those critically important root associations with other living things that really boost their ability to grow and thrive. So, although there are many problems associated with pinning all our hopes on vegetation, there's no question that vegetation can play a very important role in mitigating climate change. And so our priorities with vegetation must be, number one, protect existing forests worldwide. Absolutely critically important, number one priority. They're so good at capturing carbon, and it would take so long to catch up with newly planted forests that protecting existing forests is the number one priority. And let's also focus on restoring a variety of degraded areas, restoring degraded forests, but also degraded wetlands, grasslands, many other ecosystems that do fix tremendous amounts of carbon as well. And looking at agriculture, starting to move in the direction where we have more crop tree systems in agriculture, so that carbon storage aspect becomes a critically important part of agriculture. And since worldwide, the majority of people live in urban areas, it's important for many reasons to focus on planning for trees as a critical component of urban infrastructure, and teaching people of the many important roles that trees play in our lives, which we won't have time tonight to go into, but I know that many of you are already well versed on the many benefits of trees. So if we look at natural climate solutions as a whole, protecting existing forests and restoring degraded areas, et cetera, once again, wildly differing estimates on the potential for natural vegetation to play a role in mitigating climate change, but estimates range between about 3 and 18 billion additional tons of CO2 could potentially be fixed annually. So certainly nothing to sneeze at. It's an important part of the big picture. So, but trees are only a part of the solution to climate change. Reducing emissions must remain a priority. Not reducing emissions 20 years from now, but right now, today. So let's look at the local picture. Peterborough's urban forest is declining. In the last 5 years, we've lost 10% of the urban forest canopy. The last time that this was measured was in 2020, and at that point, there was 26.8% canopy coverage. Probably you all know what I mean by canopy coverage, but when trees are in full leaf, if we were to fly a plane overhead and look at the amount of ground that's covered by the tree canopy, that's what we mean by canopy coverage. Now, the loss in the last year is attributed to removal for construction. And for at least a couple of years, there was no urban tree removal bylaw. We lost many trees at that point. Emerald ash borer has had a significant impact on Peterborough's urban tree canopy. We've lost tremendous numbers of ash trees, which were once one of the favorite species for planting for shade trees, because they have been so hardy. And many other urban stresses certainly lead to the decline of urban trees. So where do we start in trying to take better care of the trees that we have, in planting trees and caring for trees in areas that are currently untreed? So it's a really important point that 80% of Peterborough's urban forest is on private land. So I think it's a mistake that many people make, that thinking, oh, it's the city's problem. The city needs to do a better job. But certainly the city has made many wonderful efforts. They've really increased their tree planting budget, but the responsibility really lies in private landowners' hands or a partnership. So planning for carbon. So what do we want? Do we want to focus on young trees, medium-aged trees, or old trees? Well, young trees are certainly an investment in the future. When they're young, there's a fairly small amount of carbon captured, but they're the least costly. Medium-aged trees, when they're growing rapidly, do provide maximum carbon capture, so that's great. But should we cut down all the old trees? Absolutely no. They're not as effective as the medium-aged trees in sequestering carbon, but maximum carbon storage in old trees. So maybe what we want to aim for is a mix, young, medium, and old. And in general, environmental benefits increase with the leaf area size of the trees. So in terms of carbon sequestration, as well as cleaning the air, cooling the air, we want to aim for as many large trees as possible, with younger trees on the way to eventually replacing those old trees. So if we're going to be looking at planting new trees, what should we focus on? Do we want fast growing trees or slow growing trees? Well, fast growing trees, once they get past those first few years and really start to grow rapidly, they can fix a lot of carbon, but fast growing trees have a short lifespan, so they release carbon earlier. Now, slower growing trees fix less carbon in the short run, but they generally live much longer, so they can store carbon for a much longer period. So makes sense to me. We should be looking at a combination of fast growing trees and slow growing trees. Now, a number of years ago, I was involved with an urban forest program in Peterborough. It was a partnership between Green Up and the city of Peterborough. And we generated some community goals for healthy neighborhood trees that I think stand up today. So I'd like to show you this. This was created probably about 12 years ago now, but we felt it made sense for us to aim for a tree canopy coverage of at least 40%. So that's a little higher than the city's current goal, but why not aim high? And to aim for no more than 5% of any one species or 10% of any one genus. So genus, probably most of you know this, but that would be like the maple family, for example. There's many different species of maple. So if we put all our eggs in one basket and focus on only one species, if something happens like emerald ash borer, Dutch elm disease, for example, we can really wipe out a significant amount of our tree canopy in a short amount of time. We want to aim for a good variety of ages of trees. We want to aim for a majority of species that are native to Ontario. Now, urban life is particularly hard for trees. I'll get into this a little more shortly. Not all native tree species will thrive in all locations, and certainly not in tough city conditions. So there are a few non-invasive, non-native species that can be recommended, can be great shade trees as well. But we want to avoid invasive exotic species, those that will reduce biodiversity in our natural areas. And really important that we select trees that are suitable for the location. So if there's limited space to grow, we want to choose trees that are small at maturity. We want to match the species to the soil conditions, to the moisture, and to the amount of light. So where to plant? I think we all have kind of a romantic notion of trees right along the roadside, overhanging the road. But one of the worst places to plant trees actually is in the boulevards because of excessive soil compaction, exposure to road salt, air pollution from vehicles, often limited space for growing. As you can see with this tree that's been so severely pruned because of the overhead wires. And there are limited species to choose from in locations like this. And also, if there's any construction, if the sidewalk needs to be repaired, the road needs to be repaired, you know, the parking lot, the nearby parking lot, we need to remember that the roots extend far beyond the reach of the branches, and any root disturbance can be doom for trees. And keeping in mind that this is the way that we typically develop, topsoil is stripped from an area where building is taking place. There's severe soil compaction from heavy machinery driving in the construction area, and very often only a few inches of topsoil are replaced. So all those wonderful natural support systems of trees with those really important microorganisms, they're gone when we want to plant in newly developed areas. And urban trees are typically thirsty. When you think of the amount of roof area and paved area in new developments, tremendous amount of rainwater runoff, which of course can lead to flooding, but also leaves trees thirsty. if you look at these, well-intentioned little trees planted in this developed area, those trees many of them will die from lack of moisture. There just isn't time for the rainwater to run into the soil. That's assuming that there is enough rainwater. And access to moisture is directly related to tree growth and carbon sequestration. So we won't have time really tonight to get into what species are recommended. We can certainly stay and chat about that, but just a few examples. If you've got limited amount of space, serviceberry is a really urban hardy tree. Native flowering crabapple is not native, but not invasive. They can be gorgeous trees, really great for pollinators. So if there's limited space, they can be a good choice. Medium-sized trees, hackberry, ginkgo, once again, is not native, but not invasive, slow-growing, long-lived tree. Kentucky coffee tree is another potential choice for medium-sized tree. One of my favorite large trees for the Peterborough area is bur oak. It's a really tough urban hardy tree, very slow-growing, but long-lived. Freeman maple, which is a hybrid between our native silver and native red maples. There are many cultivars of Freeman maple, is a great choice for roadside planting, very hardy. Honey locust is another fast growing tree, as well as silver maple. So just a few to choose from in some of those high stress areas. And certainly the palette is much greater if you're talking about backyards or parkland. So just really briefly, tree planting basics. I'm sure everyone has their favorite approach to planting trees. The way that I like to plant trees, I learned from Henry Koch, who was the head horticulturist at the Guelph Arboretum. And you don't dig the hole any deeper than the size of the root ball so that the root ball is resting on solid soil, but you make a wide hole. So fairly shallow, but wide. And soil from the bottom half of the hole, you leave that, you put that in a separate pile. Soil that you're digging out from the top half of the hole, you put in a separate hole, a separate pile. And the bottom half of the hole, you replace the subsoil with no amendments whatsoever. Top half of the planting hole, you mix the topsoil with compost, ideally. You can add some bone meal that helps to stimulate good, strong roots. If the hole is totally dry when you're planting the tree, better to fill it with water before you plant the tree, let it drain out, and mulch, mulch, mulch the top of the planting hole and protect the trunk, especially in urban areas. Now, trees will grow up to twice as quickly if their roots are not competing with grass. Many types of grass actually put chemicals into the soil that inhibit the growth of trees. It's one of the ways that grass tries to not be outcompeted for sunlight. So leave the grass out of the planting hole and in as wide a stretch as you possibly can around and underneath the tree. And no nitrogen fertilizer for at least the first year. You don't want to force top growth. Newly planted trees need to repair their roots. That's the #1 priority. So this is just a shot of some tree planting a number of years ago. Ideally, I'd like to have a couple of tarps here where we can discard the sod that we've dug out, compost it somewhere else, and separate the topsoil from the subsoil. And you can see in the background here, there's a wheelbarrow full of wonderful leaf compost to integrate in with the top half of the planting hole. So just briefly, aftercare, and I'll try and wrap up shortly. Drip hoses are a wonderful way to water trees. Just pouring a bucket of water around a tree really does next to nothing. The water needs to soak down at least 6 inches into the soil. So drip hoses are a good way to do that, leaving them to drip for several hours. And as I mentioned, keeping a grass-free ring around the trunk, mulched to keep down competition and keep the roots cool, and top dressing around the root zone with compost, or after a couple of years after planting, manure annually will help to keep trees healthy. So it's very important to remember, you know, as I mentioned earlier, we often don't think about what we don't see, but most of trees' roots are in the top 6 to 12 inches of soil. So it's not a mirror image. A lot of people think that all the roots go down really deep, but the majority of those critically important feeder roots are just in the very top portion of soil. So any of our trees, whether they're established or newly planted, they need watering during periods of drought. Trees are tough. They often don't show their stress until they're really stressed. So, and always avoid disturbance to the root zone. Don't park your cars under the trees. Oh, drives me crazy when I see beautiful trees and cars parked underneath them. Try and limit foot traffic. We love our trees, but try and limit foot traffic or driving any sort of heavy equipment over the root zone. And use a leaf compost. And related to that, it breaks my heart when I see people raking up their leaves and sending them out with the green waste, even if those leaves are being made into compost, which is great. City of Peterborough's had a composting program for a long time. But think of all the fuel that's burned in transporting those leaves. If you can possibly keep the leaves on site, they are one of the most important things that feeds those critically important microorganisms in the soil. So in the fall, when the leaves fall, just running a lawnmower over them will break them up into small enough pieces that in many cases, unless you've got just a gigantic tree canopy, they'll just compost on the lawn. Or store them to mix with your backyard composter. I hope you're all backyard composting. Uses less fossil fuel. And applying leaf compost on a regular basis will benefit both your trees and your lawn. So these are just wheelbarrows of leaf compost spread out on the lawn, and then they'd all be raked into the lawn. It really benefits what's going on underground. And briefly, just to wrap up here, we don't have time to go into this in great detail, but certainly there are many other environmental benefits to having a healthy population of trees around us. Shade trees on the south side of buildings can reduce summer cooling costs. If you're air conditioning your home, it can reduce those cooling costs and of course save energy, which means less CO2 in the air, but can reduce your cost by 20%. If you live in an exposed location, especially many of us living out in the country, if you plant evergreen trees on the north and west sides of a building to break the winter winds, that can reduce your winter heating costs by 15%. Certainly, if we plant food trees in urban areas, whether they're fruit trees or nut trees, and use those foods, then that can reduce also fossil fuel consumption by reducing transportation costs for food. And a healthy urban forest canopy not only cools in the summer by shade, but trees are actually living air conditioners, and they will literally reduce the temperature, the air temperature. So it keeps us more comfortable during the summer. And shaded sidewalks, shaded roads have certainly a much longer lifespan as well. So that reduces replacement costs and further stresses for urban tree roots. So planting trees is a wonderful thing to do for very many reasons. But planting and caring for all of our trees is even better for climate change and for so many other reasons. So that's it. Well, a little over half an hour. And I hope we have some time now for discussion, questions. I know many of you are very knowledgeable folks and may have different perspectives to bring. So I welcome any feedback or comments or questions that you might have.
Okay, before we start with that, Cathy, I just would really like to thank you for clearly outlining the challenges and solutions. We know the problem is clear. 420 parts per million was a record high of carbon dioxide last week. And I didn't know that global forests could only remove a quarter to a fifth of the CO2 emissions. I keep hearing stories about the Trillion Tree campaign, that global program the World Wildlife Fund is involved with, and Canada's 2 billion tree program. And I was thinking, this is so great. And of course it is, but like anything else, it's not that simple. Global reforestation isn't going to solve the problem. Trees aren't enough. We need to reduce emissions. We just can't get away from that. It's shocking to think that 10% of the Peterborough tree canopy was lost in the last 10 years. No, last 5 years. And so this tree event that the city is hosting with 4RGrandchildren is responding to that, partly to give people the opportunity to get trees for free. And 4RGrandchildren was quite involved as well in the new tree canopy bylaw. Kate Grierson, I think she's here tonight, had a lot to do with that, and a few other people. So there's a lot of amazing information, and that's probably too much for anyone to remember. So we will be posting the recording of this Zoom presentation on our website. We usually get that up in a day or two. And so you can refer back to some of Cathy's suggestions about having a mix of ages and species, having native species, how to care for the trees after you've planted them, good places to plant them, things to be aware of. And one last thing before we go for questions is, if you do want to pick up free trees from the city of Peterborough, if you live in Peterborough, you do have to register online and let them know ahead of time that you're coming to pick a tree up on May 14th. And finally, your connection to climate change and the fact that there's a lot we can do is really empowering. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so questions and comments. Kate Grierson says, very informative, Cathy. Thank you so much. People can put their questions in the chat, or if you want to use the raise hand function.
Well, I will ask a question. Actually, it's more of a, actually, Deborah beat me. Go ahead, Deborah.
Okay. All right. So thank you, Cathy. That was really interesting. I'm just reading right now, Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, and I've been thinking about trees a lot. My question is about cedar trees. A lot of people in urban environments use cedars as, screens from their neighbors in the backyard, and, shelters. They can work as a great hedgerow, windbreak. How are they in comparison to more of the deciduous trees in terms of their ability to store carbon?
Well, apparently it's leaf surface area that is the important deciding factor. The greater the leaf surface area, the greater the carbon sequestration potential. So certainly cedars do grow fairly quickly. They may not have the same surface area as a broadleaf tree, but they photosynthesize for a longer period of the year. So apparently, there's differences species to species, but in general, broadleaf trees and evergreen trees, on an annual basis, of similar leaf surface area have similar potential to fix carbon. So and certainly now cedar trees would not be a good choice in really high stress areas. They're not tolerant of road salt. So if they're in an area where they're going to be exposed to salt spray, they would not be a good choice. But as long as they're protected from salt spray, they can thrive in a wide variety of conditions. Once they're established, they can tolerate a certain amount of drought. They can also grow in fairly wet places. So and it's one of the sacred trees for the Anishinaabe. So it's a great tree to have around for many reasons.
Thanks very much, Kathy.
Thank you. Yeah.
Guy has a question.
I think I've got one question. I got a whole sheet full of them. But first of all, Cathy, thanks so much for this. It's really great. And I was just doing a little bit of looking through city websites, and about a month ago with regard to research for this tree event that we're holding, and I saw your name on that 2011 urban forest report, and it made me think, oh, I have some degree of confidence in this now. I saw your name. I think Jacob's name might have been there as well. A lot of names that I recognized, but it seems to have not been implemented, because right now the city has got a tree bylaw that says they're going to plant 800 trees per year. And I'm going to have to go back and look at that website and see if this makes any sense. But they said here on their website that there's 2,323 healthy trees were cut down in 2 years, and they're planning to replace them at a rate of 800 per year, and we'll never catch up unless they do better than that. And I know they're going on private property and everything like that, but how and we're never going to catch up. Sorry, I'm really angry about that whole thing, but we're not going to catch up. The document that you produced, or you helped to produce 12 years ago, there was 5 years later, there was an update. The update seemed like it was right in line with that, but current practice is not getting us there. What can we do?
Well, of course, there's, sorry, I'm getting a message that my internet is unstable. So I hope you can hear me.
It's good right now.
Not as
But
unstable as I am
there's
right now. It's like,
you know, there's always a conflict between, okay, we don't want to necessarily participate in urban sprawl. I mean, you know, cutting down trees in rural areas for development. But if we intensify in urban areas in terms of building more homes, then you know, we're losing little remnant forests that we have in urban areas, which are important for many reasons. Certainly this project that I'm working on with children is exposure to even little remnant forests is just so important for children's development. But certainly the push to want to provide more housing is definitely at odds with a healthy urban forest. And so how do we balance this? You know, there are more people, we want more houses, building more houses stimulates the economy. You know, personally, I think rather than assuming that human population must, and it's a good thing that we keep growing and keep growing, I think in our discussions, if we start to realize that, you know, population stability, or even if population is declining, this is not a bad thing, because in the long run, that's what we'll have to do so that we get to the equilibrium that we need, so that we have enough spaces for people, but also enough spaces for trees and many other living things. So there's definitely no easy solution to your suggestion or your question, Guy. And I did have a major role to play in that, the development of the Urban Forest Strategic Plan in 2011. But let me tell you, that process, like we recommended much more stringent guidelines than what were finally accepted. And, you know, it kind of boiled down to a really watered down version of what there seemed to be some consensus on the organizing team. So it's always a matter of, you know, juggling priorities. And I do see that the push to increase housing provincially is just completely at odds with keeping, you know, enough healthy trees. So I wish I had an answer for you.
well, if it was watered down from what you wanted, and it hasn't been implemented the way you recommended either, and it's worse, and it's just getting worse and worse. And we're now planning to plant 800 trees a year to overcome the fact that we're cutting down 2,000 trees per year. That's just doesn't add up.
Well, you know, I think education about the many values of trees is part part of the answer. So many people are just, they're thinking about, liability. Oh, I don't want that tree to fall on my house. And oh, there's going to be more storms. Well, better cut down this tree so that it doesn't fall on the house, because I wouldn't be able to afford to, replace the house. But if we all really realize the value, if we have to, and I hate to have to translate the value of trees into dollars and cents, but sometimes that's the starting point for the decision makers, is the dollar value equivalent of carbon sequestration and savings in cooling costs and cleaning the air and whatever, stabilizing water runoff and all of that. So having those kinds of figures can be helpful in changing the opinions of the decision makers, but there's a long way to go.
I'd just like to point out for those that are on any kind of a time budget, it is 8:02 now, so technically that's our hour, but we'll keep asking questions. I see a couple more hands up. Steve, you had your hand up and then took it down. Did you have a question? Steve Russell?
Well, Guy pretty well asked it all, but I would add, just to pick up on Cathy, I was on the original tree committee and sat, it was called Made for Shade. And we made a bunch of recommendations around planting trees in our public spaces to protect our children from the sunlight. And that never got implemented either, as far as the evidence I can see. So it's a chronic problem and we are all getting older, but the value of the tree, Cathy, there is an app that I've seen students demonstrate it at the Lindsay campus of Fleming College. They have a workshop, or used to have a workshop every year to educate us public people about the value proposition for a tree on my own private property. And I wondered if you could comment on your knowledge of that app and how it does convert the size of the tree to money.
That's news to me. I must say that I'm a bit of a Luddite, I suppose, and I'm not familiar with the app, but I'd love to check it out. And what's the name? What's the name of the app?
My memory's, I think it's iTree, but I will email you. I'll give you the name of the lady who runs the program. It's called the Forestry Technician Program at the Lindsay campus of Fleming College. And my granddaughter went there and graduated 2 years ago, and she's now at the University of New Brunswick taking 2 years of forestry. So I won't take up any more time, but I'll go offline with you. But I thought it was a very interesting app to bring the dollar and cents to both the public. If I'm going to buy a tree and it's going to save me this amount of money, or the politicians who have to develop policy to make sure this stuff happens. And on both fronts, politicians or the public, we have to educate them. I will go offline with you on that.
Thank you. Thank you for that suggestion.
Sorry. Okay. There is another interesting search engine called Ecosia. I put the name in the chat. And I don't know who funds it, but for every certain number of searches that you make on Ecosia, there are trees that get planted. So it's an easy way to get a few more trees in the ground.
And I did want to add a comment to something that you had said earlier there, Cathy, in terms of the bagging of leaves and taking them out to the curbside. And yes, the baking of the paper and the trucking the leaves around and then composting it and trucking it back to people's houses and all the fuel related to that. And that's been anyways, it's bothered me for a long time that people bag up all those leaves. And I mean, not only can you compost them, but I take, there's the part of my lawn that's I want as lawn, and the rest I rake underneath the trees. So that the trees themselves, most of them are not, except for the bigger ones, are not places that are lawn. They're just big areas of leaves that I keep underneath the trees. And even some of the smaller trees, I've got, you know, maybe an 8 or 10 foot diameter circle of leaves that I just rake on there and throw a couple of rocks or stumps or something that kind of make it look a little bit more natural. And it's great fun to see how the birds and squirrels and fireflies, we had more fireflies last spring than we've ever had, and since I've been doing that. And that's a great way to get rid of those leaves. And then the ones that are too far for me to rake there, I do what you do, mulch them with the lawnmower. And some of those I'll put the bag on and pick those mulched leaves up and use those in the vegetable garden as well. So yeah, watching all those leaves go out on trucks just horrifies me. So I'm glad you commented on that. I also forgot to, in announcing that we're at 8 o'clock, forgot to thank everybody for showing up tonight. It's turns out this is the 12th month that we've been doing this, and so it's we've been ranging in numbers from 25 up to 75, and with a lot of 30s and 40s in there. We maxed out at I think it was 32 tonight, screens sharing, and so it's been a year of 4RGMeets, and it's fun to see you guys keep coming back and new people showing up. So enough of me. We're on to Sue has a question as well.
Well, you're
Yeah, thanks. I was reading a year or two ago about, I think it was in Japan, where they developed this intensive mini forests where there was really a lot of diversity, and it represented more of like a forest ecosystem than the way that we typically plant urban trees. And I wondered if you're familiar with that, Cathy, and if you know of anybody who's doing that locally.
Good question, Sue. I haven't specifically heard about that. I think there's great potential to expand existing forested areas and planting in that way, so that you've got access to all those wonderful microorganisms in the soil. So that's a potential if people have properties that border on forested area. Rather than expanding the lawn, let's expand the treed area. But I think there's great potential for that, because as we mentioned, when we plant trees and it's the lollipop trees surrounded by grass, they're not going to grow nearly as quickly if that's our focus is for fixing carbon, as if they're not competing with grass. And so recreating a forest with some of the forest understory plants and maximizing biodiversity certainly makes a lot of sense. And I think that there's even more psychological benefits for people to walk through what is or appears to be a natural forest, rather than through lollipop trees in a parkland. So I think it's a great idea. I'd love to know more about it.
Thank you. Deborah has another question.
I'll put this out for Cathy or anybody else to comment on. When we talk about urban canopy, one of the things I just heard about recently was that developers who are doing new housing developments, and I guess this is going to be a thing now for the next number of years, there's some regulation that they have to create or make space for a small parkette or whatever within a housing subdivision. But there's also an opt-out clause for the municipality to take cash instead. The developer has to compensate the municipality either in some green space or some cash. And in our municipality in City of Kawartha Lakes, Lindsay area, apparently that's becoming more of a desirable thing to do, because then the Parks Department doesn't have more work and they don't want to hire more staff to maintain more parks. does anybody have any comments on that or know anything about that happening? Or I'm just putting it out there as something I was quite disturbed to hear about. At first it sounded great, but then there's this opt-out option that just defeats the whole purpose.
Well, that option has been on the table in developments for years and years in most municipalities in Ontario. It's still up to the council to either accept or reject a proposal from the developer if they want to get cash in lieu, is what's always called cash in lieu of parkland. So it's usually the smaller developments that they agree to automatically, whereas the bigger ones, most municipalities anyway, municipalities I worked for, the city of Peterborough and Hamilton Township, the larger developments, it was turned down because they're looking for parkland whenever there's a large development. But if it's only something relatively small, whatever, 8-10 homes, then cash in lieu becomes a lot more attractive, I guess, to the municipality. But yeah, that option, cash in lieu, has been around for as long as I've worked for municipalities, for like 40 years, 30 years anyway.
So I guess it comes down to the pressure that people put on the councillors to make sure they make the right decision on that.
Yeah, that's true. I think that's where, talking to counselors and so on makes a big difference. But I guess, it still comes down to money and how much they value green space versus some more money in the coffers. So it's a tough one.
Yeah, there's a couple
Well,
of
I could
things in
see.
the chat. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I could see there might be situations where using that money to plant trees in a more tree-friendly location might make sense. To say, well, we'll pay you the cash, but we won't spend the money on trees, doesn't make sense at all to me. But in a new development, if the area has been so badly compromised, I could see in some cases, especially in small developments, as was suggested, that it might make more sense to spend that money on planting trees in established parks, or where there's been less recent disturbance, where there might be a better chance of the trees surviving. But I think there should be a caveat that the money can't be spent on anything other than trees or parks.
Yeah. A couple of things in the chat. Sue Sauvé has posted a link to the mini forest article that she mentioned. And Cathy asks, okay, she says, we have a city park in our neighborhood. It has a few trees, but I'd love to see more. How do you go about getting trees planted in city parks? Also, how are trees in city parks supposed to be cared for?
That was my question. And we live up on Spenceley's Lane, and there's quite a large city park there, and there were some trees planted in the fairly recent new trees. But then during the drought, I guess it was 2 summers ago, we had the terrible drought. I forget when it, but we were lugging water over there because they weren't being watered, and they were dying, So I didn't know who's responsible once the trees are planted in a city park. I mean, we did, and some of the other neighbors did water them, but I mean, I don't know. The question.
Well, I did actually. I worked for a few summers for the Parks Department, and I know how short they are on staff to do things like that, like to water trees. And I've noticed in the last few years that they've started using the tree bags, where you can fill it up from a water truck, and the water just gradually seeps into the soil. But unfortunately, that often doesn't happen until somebody really complains. It'll go to the top of the priority list if taxpayers are calling the city and complaining, like, why aren't these trees being watered? that will elicit a response. In many other cases, it's not until the trees actually start to drop their leaves that they would be watered, in which case, you know, it's really, really severe drought stress. But I would say that to whatever extent is possible for the neighboring folks to look after those trees, you know, do what you can, like tell the city that they need water, but also, you know, if you can help to care for those trees, do. And, you know, you can't necessarily stretch a hose with a, you know, with a drip hose all the way into a city park, but you can have some pretty good success if you drill just a couple of really tiny holes in the bottom of like a 5-gallon bucket, and then you fill that up with water, then that will drain out really slowly. And I know there are some urban tree programs where those buckets are just part of their tree planting programs. You know, okay, I guess you've got to bring buckets of water in your car or carry them from your house, but at least there's that slow release, which is so important. And at the end of the day, if we can realize it's got to be a shared responsibility, you know, our urban trees are shared responsibility between the city and private citizens. And the more we can work together, the better.
Yeah, and there is a fire hydrant in the park, but we asked somebody once, one of the city, you know, can we use that for the trees? And no, I mean, you know, you have to unlock it for use. It's for fire. So they don't, I guess they don't want people using it to water trees. I don't know. Anyway, but yeah,
it's probably really high pressure water. It would probably, you know, probably have to have special hoses.
Right. Thank you.
Connie, go ahead.
This isn't really a question, but I was listening to a celebrity the other day, and they were saying that that their fans were planting trees for them, and they were planting thousands and thousands of trees. And I thought, if every little bit helps, more of us should be saying, you know, instead of flowers, please, you know, plant a tree, or you know, even have if we did a fundraiser sometime, it would be, you know, in some regard to planting trees, or just more little things where we bring emphasis to people about how important they are, and could they please do that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask a question, Cathy, about older trees? Our son lives off of Forest Hill, just off of Park Hill Road. And last year, the neighbor behind him cut down 4 coniferous trees that were well over 100 years old. They were beautiful trees. Everybody was just sick in the whole neighborhood about it. But is there any kind of a bylaw that prevents you from cutting down? Now it's on private property, so I suppose if it's your property, you have the right to do whatever. But is there nothing to protect those really beautiful old trees? Nothing at all?
Well, yeah, well, in Peterborough, I understand that there is a bylaw now, and I believe it was voted in last summer, where you have to get a permit to be able to remove a healthy tree, and you can get a permit through an arborist. I think it costs $50 to get a permit through an arborist, and so the arborist would have to approve this. And I think it costs $150 to get a permit through the city, but still somebody has to give permission, because if you cut down trees without having approval, if they're healthy trees, you know, and they're not any kind of a hazard, then I believe that there is a penalty. Now, if I recall, I think there was a $500 penalty, and there was some discussion that maybe the penalty should be higher than that. But there is a requirement now that you have to get approval before you can remove the tree. So just because you own the property doesn't give you the right, in the city of Peterborough at least, to be able to remove the tree. But let me tell you, that was suggested for a long time, that there be a tree cutting bylaw, and that was resisted for a long time. So it's a step forward. But of course, you can have bylaws, but they don't mean much unless they're enforced, and it takes staff time to go and follow up, and neighbors reporting on each other. If, your neighbor's cutting a tree and didn't have a permit. So it's can be expensive to enforce.
But basically they can. I mean, so as long as you
So
get that,
if they
as long as you get that permit.
if they get the permit, but it's not as easy as just applying for the permit and getting the permit. There has to be some perceived benefit to cutting down these trees. Yeah.
I just pasted a link to the city bylaw. I happened to have it up on a browser nearby because I was looking at the stuff about Cathy before, but it's probably I'm sure you're right, Cathy. It's very recent. And I have to say, Kate Pearson, who was on the call, was one of the people from 4RG who pushed very hard to get that that bylaw passed. But it was a big uphill struggle, big uphill struggle. But I wanted to ask you a question, Cathy, about what you were saying about species of trees that should be planted. And the very first, one of the very first far away. One of the very first presentations that 4R Grandchildren did in Peterborough here had Gordon Miller attend. He was at the time the Environment Commissioner, and he showed some graphics that said we shouldn't be planting the trees that grow here now. We should be planting the trees that grow 40 years south of us, so as climate change approaches us, we can be ready with the climate, with the trees that are growing down there. So it's not, anyway, it's just a very different way of doing it. He had a really cool way of showing that. He just kind of flipped a chart that showed how the climate zones were marching north. And the other thing I wanted to say about, the other thing I wanted to say on this.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Cathy. Mine is a little aside.
I was just going to say that, well, a number of years ago, while I was still at Green Up, we did put together an information sheet on choosing the right tree. And so the first page was trees for difficult sites. So those really stressful, roadside shade trees, trees for tree-friendly sites. And then on the last page, trees for a changing world. And I don't know if you could see that, but there are a lot of Carolinian species that we were recommending, not as to plant nothing but Carolinian species, but to intersperse them, because of course, if we planted nothing but Carolinian species and we have a particularly hard winter, they may not survive. But yes, I totally agree. That's a really good approach to take. And I know that the city is planting sycamores now as one of their main street trees, which is a Carolinian tree. So from farther south from here, yes.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to say very, very quickly is I believe that for the tree that we're planting, the memorial tree that we're planting for Jessica, who died, Jessica Dalladay, one of our members who died a year ago, I think we've chosen a bur oak. So it'll be there for her grandchildren too.
Yeah, it is a bur oak. Yeah.
Yeah, I've well, first of all, I wanted to back on what Beverly was saying. So basically, if you see a neighbor cutting down a tree, is there some way that you can ask the city if they have a permit, or like you're not going to go over, hey, do you have a permit for that? Because they might just take the axe to you. So is there some way of checking that someone has a permit if you see them starting to cut down a tree?
I would imagine that you can call the city, the urban forester, Paul Hambidge, and either he or his staff would be able to check, because I think they would want to know if a tree was being cut down that didn't have a permit.
Right. Okay, and then my original question, and I guess this might go to anyone that knows, you were talking about parks and the amount of person hours that are required to maintain parks and the trees and the watering and the amount of money budgeted. And I'm just, and you mentioned, Cathy, that if you're near a park, look after those trees and help them out yourself. And I just wonder if anybody has heard of or is attempted to form, I guess, community organizations around a park that would then work together with the city to be the hands that help care for that park, kind of the friends of kind of idea. And we hear lots of people, you know, friends of this provincial park or friends of that park that will do things inside the park. But I mean, are there friends of, you know, your local city park where people will get involved and try to, you know, be the hands that care for it? Has anybody heard of that?
Sue's got her hand up and she's working on that right now, so she probably wants to talk.
Well, it strikes a chord, your question, because I'm retiring May 6th, and we've started this new little group called the Udanabe Watershed Stewards that I put in the chat. But this little thing in my head, I've watched my partner Ian Attridge over the years been advocating for better care and protection of the natural areas in the city forever. And it's really hard to get support for that through the city. And I was thinking that I think there's technically 95 parks in the city, as well as some trails. And I thought if there was a group that just organized, you know, have people sign up for different parks and different people plant, water, you know, litter, whatever it is that can improve that park, that could be an amazing initiative. Years ago, when recycling was a big thing, there was a city councilor in the city of Waterloo where I was working. Her name was Lynn Wollstonecroft, and she had all these people who wanted to volunteer for helping out with recycling. So she started a citizens committee, and she took applications, and she got 108 applications. And most committees, as you know, are like 8 to 12 people. And so she accepted every single one of them. And from there, they developed all these subcommittees. And I think where there is a strong interest, like Peterborough, survey after survey, people express these strong interests in our trees and in our parks. And I think it could be an amazing initiative, but I don't know.
I think that's a great idea, Sue. I'd love to see a group in our neighborhood. You know, I mean, a citywide thing is great, and maybe could incorporate people in, certainly in our neighborhood. The Habitat building is going up around the corner, is just opening around the corner from us on Leahy's Lane. And there'll be 41 people in that building, you know, and who might be interested in participating. I'm just thinking, you know, because I think, and there seems to be real interest. I mean, we have a boulevard garden, but we're the only ones on the street that do, because everybody else is working, and I understand that. But I think just there seems to be some interest in, you know, I think, and it's an educational process, which I think is so important. So, you know, stay in touch on that one. It's a great idea.
All right, I just found you, Sue, and I'm sharing posts from your Facebook page for our grandchildren.
Well, we just started. And I really am relying on things that I've learned from Cathy over the years. It's been many years since I've participated in one of Cathy's plantings, but it's sort of like the kinds of plantings that I've done with you before, Cathy, that our group is going to be doing. So I am not a green thumb. I wish I could have some Cathys around for this, but I know you're full up, Cathy.
Well, I know that there are a number of neighborhood associations, and I think the idea of focusing a neighborhood association around caring for a park makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think it's a great idea.
Great. Yeah.
Well, if there are no more comments or no more questions, then I guess we can officially bring tonight's meeting to a close. And once again, thanks for those that hung on to listen to all the questions and comments after 8 o'clock. And well, that's an extra half hour of questions and comments. So, some interest there. So that's really good to see. And thanks again.
Thank you so much, Cathy. It was a great presentation. Awesome.
My pleasure.
Yeah, there were
Thank you.
some comments of gratitude. I don't know if you saw them as they popped up on Zoom. Did you, Cathy? Okay, good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So good night, everybody, and we'll see you next week.
next
Or
month.
next month, I mean, ooh, careful.
Thanks for joining.
Thank the host